Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we're reading issue number 109, and just a little catch-up on what happened in the last issue. I guess John was a little light on cash, so John somehow got wrangled into being the magician at a rich guy's party, I guess because it paid well. And it wasn't just a regular party, it was some kind of crazy orgy that was going on. And one of the attendees of this orgy was the gymnast coach of a young woman who was being abused by her father. And as the festivities kicked off at this crazy party orgy, John was doing his fake magic, but for some reason, the gods actually answered him and replied in the form of two deities from the green, and they were called the He and She of Mendwa. And they seemed to be deities of partying and revelry, or maybe just chaos, because they ended up tying everybody with vines that was in the party, and then the She of Mendwa possessed the gymnast coach and went over to the gymnast house and then possessed the gymnast girl and had her kill her father right before he was going to sexually assault her. And we left that issue with the He of Mendwa telling John some crazy stuff is going to start happening, and that he brought this upon himself for messing with forces he didn't understand. And that is where we left off. So first things first, with issue 109, we got the cover. We see John on the cover smoking, of course, and he's facing us, but it's like he's hearing a noise and he's kind of barely showing any interest in something behind him. And what's behind him are three horses galloping straight towards him. And the riders on top of them are humanoid creatures that kind of look like Beast from X-Men. They're all hairy and their faces have very canine features. And we also see on the cover that this is written by Paul Jenkins with art by Sean Phillips. And as we turn to the first page, we start off in what looks like the English countryside. We see a man with sheepdogs and sheep behind him, and he's examining a piece of grain like something's wrong with it. And a text box in the first panel says, "This is last month." And as the man examines the grain, he says, "This is wrong. Dead bloody wrong." And then he pulls out a walkie-talkie and he activates it and says, "Let's see, I'm out by Jedrovin late at the North Gate, Dad. I found some more crop damage. Could be chemical seepage. Don't forget that shite they dumped out at the plastic works last year." Then all of a sudden, his sheepdogs take off running, and he looks at them and says, "What's up with you, sorry pair of buggers? Come by." But they don't listen to him, so he follows them. Then we get a panel of something strange. It's a red panel, so it must be like a flash inside of maybe this farmer's head. But we see a sheep that's being torn apart, and part of the face of the beast that's attacking it. And the dogs have gone over this stone wall, so as the farmer approaches, he says, "All right, let's have a look then." And as the man steps over the short stone wall, he says, "See? There's nothing there, you daft apiths." But then his grip on the wall slips, and he falls forward onto the ground, and face first into a bunch of sheep guts from a sheep that was torn apart the previous night. And as he pulls his face out of literally the stomach of this sheep, he says, oh God. And we can see there's blood and stuff all in his mouth and his nose. And just underneath these panels, we see the name of this issue is The Wild Hunt. Then we get to John and all his friends inside of a pub, and Rich is telling everybody a joke saying, "So the cow says, 'Move over,' and the sheep says, 'Bollocks.'" And before anybody can laugh, if they were going to, we see Chaz run in and say, "Oi, Constantine!" And as John turns to Chaz, we do see Rich with a very annoyed look on his face staring at Chaz as well, because obviously Chaz just interrupted his very funny joke. And as Chaz stops in front of John, John sarcastically says, "Don't tell me. The lovely Renee strikes again." And Renee is Chaz's wife. And Chaz answers John, "Yeah, well, not her exactly. Look, I need your help, all right?" And then he looks kind of embarrassed as he says, "It's her Uncle Wilf, the one with the farm in Yorkshire. Something's been chewing up his sheep. Only it's weird, like them cattle mutilations, you know? And I thought, well, you know all about that mad shit." And then Rich interjects with his theory, "Obvious, and it chuckles. That's your space invaders, that is." And John jokes, "Sheep buggers from Venus, most likely." And then John stands up to go to the toilet, and as he passes Chaz, Chaz says, "Come on, John. It's not bloody funny. You know what she's like." And as John goes to the door, he says, Exactly, mate. She's a never-ending punch in the bladder. And as John goes through the doors, we do see in the panel there is a young black woman just standing against the wall like she's hovering around them to hear what they're saying. Then we cut to John in the restroom, and as he pees in a urinal, he's singing, Farmer Giles, he was there, sickle in his hand, and every time he turned around, he circumcised the band. Then from behind him, a woman says, Mr. Constantine? Then we see in the next panel, it is the black woman who is hanging around them talking, and she has a tape recorder in her hand, and as she clicks it on, she says, Dana Wright, Weekly World Star, how about a comment on Harcourt Fenton's little romp last month? Pretty wild, huh? And John is startled, and his cigarette falls out of his mouth as he says, Do what? Look, I'm trying to wring me sock, love. But she ignores John and just continues saying, English politicians, you gotta love them. Any royals show up? So I think what's going on here is this woman has heard that John was doing some magic at the orgy that happened in last month's issue, and because a bunch of weird stuff happened there, I guess she worked for a tabloid or something and wants a scoop, so she's tracked down Constantine. But when John doesn't say anything, she just walks up to him, and keep in mind, he's still at the urinal holding himself, and she holds out a card, and as John stares at her, she's actually staring down at his penis. And then she says to John, Tell you what, Mr. Constantine, John, how about you give me a call sometime? I'd love to hear the dirt directly from the source. My home number's at the bottom. I'll just leave this on the sink, okay? I can see you have your hands full. And then she walks over to the sink, places the card on it, and then walks out of the restroom. Then we see John walking out of the restroom with the card in his hand, and he narrates to himself, Much as I enjoy shafting England's gullible gentry, I'm not about to go spilling the beans to any sodding reporter, even a tasty little Yank tart like this one. In my experience, the best remedy for this sort of headache is to lay low for a while. So then John looks up at Chaz and says, I'll do it, but you drive. So it seems John is going to take Chaz's problem as an opportunity to lay low for a while. And at John saying that Chaz is going to drive, Chaz says, What? I can't take any time off, John. I'm totally skint as it is. Then John walks over to the bar and picks up his pint, and he finishes it saying, Don't worry about it. One day your ship will come in, mate. And Chaz replies, Yeah, and when it does, I'll be driving you to the bleeding airport. Come on, then. And as they turn to walk out, Rich yells at Chaz, Oi, Chuckles! Chucklepunk! Chaz! And Chaz turns around annoyed and says, What? And then Rich smiles evilly and then holds his hand up in the Vulcan live long and prosper sign from Star Trek, and he says to Chaz sarcastically, Live long and crispy, Earthman! And we see Straff and Michelle behind him laughing at Rich and Chaz. Then we turn the page and we cut to last week, and we see the farmer that fell face first into the sheep guts is playing rugby in the rain, but he doesn't look like he's having a very good time. He's kind of holding himself like he's cold or something. And as he's looking around the field, he's seeing sheep, and we're not sure if they're actually there or not, because in the next panel, we see a sheep that is in a red panel, very reminiscent of the one from earlier where we saw the beast ripping apart the sheep, just before this guy fell face first into the sheep guts. So obviously this guy is distracted. One of his teammates yells out, Phil! And throws the ball to him, and as Phil catches it, we see the ball turn into a sheep's head, which is what Phil is hallucinating, because all of the other players keep playing, and one of them yells, Phil, you playing, man? You're over the bloody touchline. And as Phil looks up at his teammate, he sees his friend talking, but instead of a human head, his teammate has a sheep's head, and it's saying to him, Phil, what the fuck's wrong? And I guess because he's freaked out from his hallucinations, Phil punches his teammate in the face, and then runs off yelling, Don't fucking touch me! Don't you fucking touch me, all right? Then we turn the page and we cut to present again, where John and Chaz are sitting in Uncle Wilf's house, and they're at the dining table, and John is looking at pictures of the sheep mutilation. And over these panels, John's narration says, As it turns out, North Yorkshire is a lot like it appears on the telly, only crappier. True to form, Chaz starts moaning the first time he gets shit on his feet. Renee's Uncle Wilf turns out to be a fairly decent old lad, though. Quite a surprise, considering his simian relatives down in the urban jungle. And as John looks at the pictures, Uncle Wilf, who looks like a no-nonsense older white man who's balding and smoking a pipe, says over John's shoulder, Our Chaz says you're quite the expert in such matters, John. And John replies, You could say that, Wilf, yeah. And Wilf continues, Aye, well, whatever took that sheep apart, it were no bloody dogs. I can tell you that for nought. Our lad Phil reckons it smelt funny. Its femur was severed with a bloody laser by the looks of it. And then he takes a drag on his pipe and says, Bloody mad this is. Bloody mad. Me crops falling out all at once, 12 animals butchered in a month, and I even had 2 dogs go missing last week. And as he says this, Wilf turns and begins to walk towards the front door. Then we turn the page and we see Wilf is outside smoking, and John has followed, also smoking. And as Uncle Wilf stares at the pastures outside his door, he says, There's badness going on here, John. I can feel it. Like, I've lived here all me life, right? Only now, suddenly, Tanergy's all wrong. And as John stands next to Uncle Wilf, he says, Wrong? How's that then, Wilf? And Uncle Wilf turns to him and says, Well, I don't know. It's like an illness in the air or something, and I'm not the only one who can sense it either. It's making my boy Phil dead poorly. And as he says this last line, we get a panel of Phil on his bed, and his eyes are wide open like he's in some sort of trance or something. Then we turn the page and we cut to last night, and we see Phil is at a local pub, and he's sitting at a table and he's gripping his glass very hard, and we see as all the people are talking around him, Phil is seeing sheep all over the floor, and the sheep are bleating as they walk around, and Phil is side-eyeing them, and he seems very anxious and nervous by them, and then as he looks back to his pint, he sees it's full of sheep guts, and then he jumps up and spills his pint everywhere, and he yells out, I can't stay here! And then all the other patrons in the bar stare up at him, and as he runs away, we see he's seeing them all with sheep heads, and they're all saying, Bah! Bah! And then we see him walking through the streets of his town, and he's beginning to undress, and he's yelling, Oh, Jesus Christ, what's going on? And then as he stares up, we do see it's a full moon, and as he screams out in pain, his teeth begin to grow into fangs. Then we get another flash of one of those red panels of a wolf-like creature biting into a femur. Then we cut back to Phil, and his body is contorting further, and we see a sheep on the side of the road staring at him. Then we turn the page. We see Uncle Wilf is showing John and Chaz the mess that was left over from another sheep that was ripped apart, and it just happens to be the sheep that was staring at Phil as he was going through whatever changes were happening. And Uncle Wilf is saying to John and Chaz, Right here! Phil found it last night! Its guts were squeezed out like jam out of a donut! What a bloody mess! And John walks over to the sheep guts and he kneels down and he says, Oi, Chaz, what can you smell, mate? And Chaz sniffs for a second and then he says, I don't know, but it freaking reeks, John. It's like rotten metal. And then he holds his stomach and says, Me cubes are up so tight, they're making me armpits lumpy. And then John stands up and takes a drag of his cigarette and says, Like chewing on tinfoil. Yeah, I've heard that one before. Not just my imagination then. And Uncle Wilf says, What? What is it, lad? And John turns and says, Congratulations, Wilf. It's a werewolf. Then we turn the page and we cut to the night prior, I believe, right before Phil went to the pub. And we're getting panels in the pastures where we see not one werewolf, but 4. And it looks like one of them is on the ground after just transforming, and the others are kind of sniffing him and licking his paws. And over these panels, the narration says, The hunt have emerged out of their time, but the energy is all wrong here. There are such strange smells and sights, distant pinpoints of light that scream the proximity of mankind, and an incessant drumming that carries the drab night air, rolling over the hills like thunder. Then one of the werewolves looks up at the sky and howls, and then we get a panel of Phil looking out of his window and saying, I hear you. Then we turn the page and we cut back to John, Chaz, and Wilf as they walk back from the sheep massacre, and Wilf is saying to John, Look, I'm an open-minded lad, but still, I mean, what would you say if I said your hamster were eaten by a bloody vampire? Then we see John light a cigarette, and his narration says, He's right. Anyone but me would laugh in his face, check his arms for needle tracks, and send him packing. But there are more things in heaven and earth, see. Fact is, I've felt these particular sensations once before. Then we get a flashback where John is thinking back in the past about him as a young man, and he is wearing a suit amongst some other young men, and they're standing by a fireplace in a very nice house. And over these panels, the narration says, It happened years ago at the club. Christ, I was a little prat in those days. Sensible enough to know the importance of good connections, but far too naive to pick the right ones. I wasted 6 months trying to impress all the little wine bar yankers that lurked downstairs. Consequently, I gained a reputation as a middle-class master of the black arts. Then we see a young John kind of perk up as he looks over and sees a man sitting in a chair, and his narration continues. There was this old bloke who'd sit alone every night in one corner. No one ever sat with him, and he never spoke. He smelled like rotten chewing gum wrappers. I was curious and determined to prove myself, so one night I strolled over. I was half expecting to find Bela Lugosi in the shadows, to be honest. So as John approaches the man sitting in the chair, he's kind of in shadow, we can't see his face, but he is smoking a cigarette that's in a cigarette holder. And the man says to John, I wondered when you might join me, Constantine. And John's narration continues. His voice was utterly unique, like listening to all the secrets of history on an old scratchy record. 3,000 years ago, he began, as if he'd been waiting to tell me all that time. So as the old man begins his story, we see a couple panels of what look like Greeks or Romans because they're wearing togas, and they have clubs, and there's a werewolf and a wolf that come upon them. Then in the next panel, we see 3 werewolves, so we can kind of assume that these men were turned into werewolves, and they have killed and are eating a cow. And in John's narration, he explains what the old man told him, saying, a disease appeared in Europe before there was anyone to record it. Those infected underwent a remarkable change. It was like a plague. The population had enough sense to isolate those who carried the illness, but there was a fear that magnified their mistrust. Because the plague carriers didn't die. They lived forever. Then we get a panel of young John as he adjusts his collar because he seems kind of scared as this old man finishes his story. And John's narration says, don't ask me how, but I knew it was true. The conviction in his voice could only mean one thing. He'd been there. Then a young John asks the man, well, why did it happen in the first place then? And then the man leans forward out of the shadows, and we see his face, and it looks like he's almost half transformed. So he still has a human head and whatnot, but his nose is definitely becoming like a werewolf's, and so is his teeth. His lips are pulled back, and you can see his fangs, and his eyes are yellow. And he says to John, because of you. Then we cut to present, as John and Wilf and Chaz are standing outside of Wilf's house still, and now the sun is kind of setting, and Chaz is saying to Wilf, sorry, Wilf, he only seems this mental. Listen to him. And Wilf says to Chaz, aye, well, nice of you lads to come all this way, Chaz, but I can't accept that sort of nonsense. And then he turns to John and continues, it's just, the pressures of running this place get to you sometimes. Losing your animals will do that to you. Plus, I've no help with Phil being laid up in bed. And upon Wilf saying this, it gives John an idea, and he points at Wilf and says, wait, you said you lost a couple of dogs, right? And Wilf looks down saddened as he smokes his pipe and says, "My God, you bloody hate to lose a good dog at the best of times. But 2? What's even worse, they were Phil's." Then we turn the page and we get a panel of Phil mid-transformation. Then we cut to Wilf's wife saying, "Wilf, Phil's gone." And as Wilf walks into his house, he says, "What? Where?" Then we see John running past the front gate of the house out to the pastures, and his narration says, "Right on cue. I should have known to expect this." And then John calls back to Chaz, I'm off for a fag, mate. Let us know if he comes back, eh?" And Chaz, looking very weirded out, says, "Fine. Thanks for caring, you tosser." Then we get a panel of Werewolf Phil running through the pastures, and over this panel the narration says, "Chaz is wrong, more's the pity. I know what's happening. I can smell the disease in the Yorkshire night air." Then we cut to John walking on a dirt path that has some trees around it along with pasture, and as John leisurely walks and smokes, his narration says, "All these years, I never did understand what that old man meant. Only now I have a chance to find out. From up ahead, the stench of pig iron and rotten leather floats downhill on the breeze. I shut my eyes tightly, trying to see the dream of the countryside." So as John closes his eyes, we see that electrified kind of energy that John learned about when he was in Australia and went in the dream time. And like when he's used it before, the energy is either leading him or telling him where to go. So as John follows the energy, his narration says, "Now I see the fracture, the dreams being torn apart. There's a flash of white, a sigh, a rumble of hooves. Then John turns around from the noises he hears and he yells out, "Christ Almighty!" And we get a panel where we see he is surrounded by werewolves on horseback and they have sharpened wooden spears in their hands. And as John stares back at them, his narration continues saying, "And suddenly, the disease is upon me." And as the werewolves look down at John, they begin to growl. And as John looks up at the closest one, he jokingly says, "Hello, lads. How's the mutton around here?" Then he looks down like maybe he said the wrong thing. And as he takes a drag of his cigarette, his narration says, "I stand and await my fate, feeling like a Mars bar at a fat farm. But nothing happens. For some reason, not that I blame them, the pack keeps a respectful distance. And then I realize they're as lost as I am. It's in their eyes. I know fear when I see it." Then as the werewolves stare at John, they dismount from their horses, and they begin to walk towards him. Then John hears a voice from behind him say, "They won't hurt you." And John turns to see another werewolf standing behind him, and John looks at him and says, "I know. You Wilf's boy then?" And Werewolf Phil kind of says, unsure, "Yeah, maybe." And then John casually lights another cigarette and says, "What happened, son?" And Werewolf Phil replies, "It weren't their fault. They're not supposed to be here. I found someone they killed, got myself infected by accident, and now I'm one of them." And we get a flash of Phil as a human falling into the sheep guts from the very first page, and we see all that blood and viscera getting into his mouth and nose and eyes. So I guess he accidentally got infected by werewolf saliva getting into his mouth. Then Werewolf Phil turns and we see where they're at is kind of on a hill, so it's overlooking the little town, and Werewolf Phil looks at it and says, "Look, something important's happening. I'm not sure what. I can see pieces of what's coming, but none of it makes any sense. I saw it in the crops before I got the sickness. Everything's dying. If you listen, you can hear it drumming. Sounds like a storm miles away, only it never stops. You know when you drop a plate, and you know it's going to break. That's what it feels like. Look at these poor bastards. It's our time, not theirs. But now they're stuck here, and I'm stuck with them. This sort of thing's happening all over. Werewolves and spirits, and fairy folk being retched back into this world. Only there's no room for 'em." And then he points at John suddenly and barks, "And it's up to you to make it right." And of course, John is confused by this, and he says, "Me? What's that supposed to mean?" But the werewolf doesn't answer, he just says, "I have to go. Tell me Mom and Dad. Look, don't tell them anything, eh? Just lie." And then the other werewolves jump on their horses, and Werewolf Phil runs alongside them as they ride off. And as John watches them go, his narration says, "A dull pounding suddenly cascades across the hills, coming from miles away. Something cries out in terror. I look over to see where the screaming came from, and when I look back, they're gone." Then we turn the page, and we cut to sometime in the future, and we see John is no longer at Wilf's house. He is walking through the front door of an apartment building, and his narration is saying, "I'm a good liar. It's what I do best, and it... So when I get back to the farm, I tell his family how I've seen this sort of thing before. Probably caught himself a sexually transmitted disease, hasn't he? Probably needs to get away for a bit. Then I make my excuses and leave, unable to look his parents in the eye. And I enlist the support of my old mate Johnny Walker just as soon as I get back. And because of what I've been told, I'm thinking he might be around for a while." So we see John with a bottle of Johnny Walker in his hand, and as he takes a swig, he rings the doorbell of one of these flats. Then we get a panel of the door opening, and we see the young black woman from the bar who approached John in the restroom and gave him her card. And I don't know if you caught it, but she's supposed to be American. John called her a Yank earlier, and all she's wearing as she answers this door is a very oversized Indianapolis Colts jersey, which is an American football team. And as she gives John a once-over, she says, "John? God, are you okay? What's happening?" And as John pushes past her into the flat, he says, "The end of the world." And that ominous last line is the end of the issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planes, trains, and comic books, all one word, at gmail.com. And we will see you on the next one.